Beneath the relentless Florida sun, long before Palm Beach became a synonym for opulence, Henry Flagler felt a quiet shift inside himself, a realization that the land he had helped transform needed to give something back to him. For years he had pushed railroads across swamps, carved towns out of wilderness, and watched the state evolve from a forgotten stretch of coastline into a destination whispered about in the parlors of New York. Everywhere he went, he saw hotels rising, gardens blooming, boulevards taking shape, and trains arriving with increasing numbers of curious travelers. Florida, once dismissed as untamable, had begun to reveal a new identity, and Flagler sensed his legacy stretching far beyond the tracks he had laid. But legacy alone was not enough. He wanted a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of expansion would finally give way to the stillness he had earned. As he traveled along the coastline, inspecting rail lines and watching small settlements transform into bustling towns, a thought began forming with unusual persistence. He had built fortunes, industries, and entire cities, yet had never built a true home for himself, a place that captured not only wealth, but meaning. The Gilded Age elite had their Newport mansions, towering monuments to ambition and extravagance. Flagler had visited these residences many times, admiring their marble halls and grand staircases, yet always sensing something missing. They were magnificent, yes, but they did not belong to the world he was shaping. His America was not the foggy Northeast. It was the world of warm winds, open skies, and the rhythmic whisper of waves against the shore. If he were to build a palace, it had to rise not from tradition, but from this new frontier he had unlocked. The more he moved through Florida, the more he felt the geography itself guiding him. Jacksonville had served as his introduction to the state. St. Augustine had shown him its history. West Palm Beach had revealed its potential. But none of these inspired the vision taking root in his mind. It was only when he arrived in Palm Beach, an island still quiet and largely undeveloped, that the idea finally crystallized. The landscape was unlike anything he had seen. Endless rows of palms bending toward the ocean breeze, dunes glowing gold at dusk, and water so calm it seemed to rest rather than flow. Here, nature was not a barrier, but a collaborator, offering light, warmth, and space with a generosity rare even in Florida. The island had a serenity that made time feel slower, as if the world paused long enough for a person to breathe deeply and imagine boldly. Standing on the shore, he could feel the sensation of entering a blank canvas, a place untouched by the heavy architectural traditions of the northern states. He envisioned a mansion not as a retreat from the world, but as a culmination of everything he had built. It would be a symbol of transformation, the physical embodiment of Florida's rise from wilderness to wonder. It would show the nation that refinement did not belong exclusively to the old and established, but could flourish in a place once dismissed as nothing more than swamp and sand. He wanted visitors to step inside and feel the same astonishment he had felt when Florida first revealed its warmth to him. The idea grew with each passing day. He imagined palm-lined paths leading to towering columns, carved stonework glimmering in the subtropical light, and a facade so commanding that it would shift the balance of prestige away from Newport. He pictured a place where music spilled through gilded rooms, where vast halls echoed with celebration, and where every detail, from murals to marble, carried the unmistakable signature of ambition fulfilled. The house would not simply rival the northern mansions, it would redefine what grandeur meant in America. By the time he left Palm Beach at the end of that season, the decision was already made. Florida had given him a purpose, a fortune, and a legacy. Now, on this island of palms and gentle tides, he would build the single structure that tied his entire journey together. It would stand as both a personal refuge and a beacon to the world, a place where the story of Florida's rise could be felt in every tile, column, and beam. Thus began the creation of the home that would come to be known as Whitehall, the masterpiece Flagler believed the new Florida deserved. The vision of his future home grew clearer with every return to Palm Beach, but choosing the exact piece of land that would carry such an ambitious dream proved more challenging than Flagler expected. The island offered beauty, yes, but it was a beauty shaped by a harsh environment, shifting sands, relentless humidity, salt, heavy winds, and soil that behaved more like powder than earth. Anyone less determined might have seen these obstacles as warnings, yet to Flagler, they were simply part of the negotiation, a conversation between ambition and nature. If his home was to stand as a testament to Florida's transformation, then it needed to rise from the very landscape that others viewed as impractical. He began walking the coastline in long, deliberate arcs, stepping through soft dunes and listening to the ocean as if waiting for a cue. Some areas were too close to the water, where tides crept farther inland than maps suggested. Others were flat but exposed, offering no natural protection against storms. And then there were parcels already eyed by small landholders, people who sensed that Flagler's growing presence could turn worthless sand into fortune. He understood that once word spread about his intentions, prices would skyrocket, and negotiations would become tangled in ego and speculation. Discretion was essential, not only to secure the right land, but to protect the house itself from becoming a spectacle before it even existed. Quietly, he employed intermediaries, trusted associates who appeared to be acting on their own behalf, purchasing modest portions of land without revealing the true client. Through this network, he could study ownership patterns, identify willing sellers, and assemble a patchwork of parcels that gradually formed a unified estate. Each acquisition required careful timing. If a seller sensed urgency, they hesitated or demanded more. If they believed the buyer was simply a seasonal visitor, conversations remained calm. The dance was delicate, but Flagler orchestrated it with the same precision he had once applied to expanding his railway empire. At the same time, he conducted private talks with surveyors and engineers. They examined the consistency of the soil, tested the depth of the groundwater, and mapped how storm winds traveled across the island. Their findings were sobering. Beneath the picturesque palms lay unstable sand, unpredictable moisture pockets, and a foundation that would require both ingenuity and caution. The climate added another layer of difficulty. Summers brought heat so intense that tools burned in workers' hands, and seasonal storms could reshape a construction site overnight. Yet, instead of discouraging him, these challenges only refined his vision. A house that could withstand Florida's temperament would be more than beautiful. It would be resilient, a structure that anchored itself not in fantasy, but in mastery over the landscape. Once the land began taking shape under his ownership, he moved to secure legal protection. Property rights in this region were a maze of old claims, ambiguous borders, and inconsistencies left behind by earlier surveyors. Flagler's legal team worked quietly but relentlessly, verifying deeds, clarifying boundaries, and consolidating holdings in a way that would prevent future disputes. Every document signed, every title transferred, brought the dream of Whitehall closer to becoming a physical reality rather than a vision carried only in his mind. With the essential groundwork in place, preparations moved to the land itself. Teams were instructed to clear brush, remove tangled roots, and create stable access routes without drawing attention from curious locals or traveling journalists who had begun speculating about Flagler's next grand undertaking. The aim was not secrecy for its own sake, but control. Control over timing, over narrative, and over the enormous logistical machine that would soon descend upon this quiet stretch of coast. By the time the vegetation had been cleared and the first markers staked into the sand, the transformation was already beginning. What had once been an untouched expanse of palms and wind-shaped dunes now held the faint geometry of something monumental. Lines stretched across the land, like the early strokes of an artist sketching the outline of a masterpiece. Even without walls or columns, the site carried an energy that hinted at what was coming. A house meant not just to stand on Florida's edge, but to redefine it. When the land was finally secured and the first outlines traced across the sand, Flagler turned to the one decision that would determine whether his dream became a masterpiece or a disappointment. Choosing the architects. He needed creators bold enough to shape a palace where none had ever stood, designers capable of transforming an empty coastline into a symbol of power and elegance. Only one firm matched his vision, Carrere and Hastings, the celebrated duo behind some of the grandest structures of the Gilded Age. Their name was synonymous with refinement, symmetry, and a near-obsessive devotion to detail. Flagler had watched their rise closely, admiring how they fused European classical ideals with the confidence of a growing America. If anyone could translate the untamed spirit of Florida into a palace worthy of comparison to Europe's finest, it was them. Carrere and Hastings arrived in Palm Beach with sketchbooks in hand, stepping onto land that seemed more like a blank page than a construction site. They listened as Flagler spoke about his dream, a home that rivaled and in time surpassed the great mansions of Newport. It needed to be grand but not gaudy, refined but not fragile, a place where light could pour through towering windows and dance across marble floors. He did not want a mere residence. He wanted a statement, a physical declaration that Florida had matured into a destination of consequence. The architects were captivated by his ambition, recognizing that this project would challenge them in ways no northern estate ever could. Their earliest sketches explored scale before ornament. They drafted sweeping facades with tall, fluted columns rising above an entry courtyard. They imagined long corridors punctuated by arches. They played with the rhythm of windows that would frame the subtropical sun. The first conceptual drawings hinted at a Beaux-Arts palace, full of symmetry, order, and classical balance, a deliberate contrast to the organic wildness surrounding the property. This style, born in Paris and embraced by America's elite, communicated power without shouting and elegance without apology. For a state still fighting for national recognition, such architecture held symbolic weight. Florida was no longer a frontier. It was ready to host culture, wealth, and influence. When the first scale model arrived, a delicate wooden structure with tiny columns and carved recesses, Flagler walked around it slowly, studying each angle with the quiet intensity of a man evaluating his own future reflected in miniature. He admired its ambition, yet questioned its restraint. The proportions needed slight adjustments. The entrance should feel more ceremonial. The staircases must appear not just functional, but majestic. Every critique he offered came with precision. He was not a man who cared for decoration without purpose. If a column stood somewhere, it must hold meaning. If a mural was planned, it must guide the eye towards something larger. This attention to detail sparked spirited debates between him and the architects. Carrere and Hastings believed deeply in the harmony of their designs, while Flagler insisted on modifications based on how guests would feel as they entered each space. He spoke about how the sunlight should fall across the marble at noon, how the breeze from the ocean should drift naturally through certain rooms, and how the entrance hall should impress without overwhelming. Some evenings, arguments stretched long past sunset, diagrams scattered across tables like the remnants of a chess match between equals. Yet beneath the disagreements lay mutual respect. The architects knew that Flagler was not meddling for the sake of control. He understood that a great house wasn't built only from stone and ornament, but from experience and emotion. As the weeks passed, the design matured into something extraordinary. Wide verandas looked onto gardens that did not yet exist. A grand staircase rose in the mind's eye before it ever took shape in marble. An interior courtyard promised sunlight, filtered through archways and greenery. The Beaux-Arts style, with its balanced proportions and dramatic flourishes, proved a perfect vessel for Flagler's vision. It carried the discipline of classical architecture while allowing for the theatrical elegance he desired. This house would not merely stand beside the mansions of Newport. It would eclipse them, not through imitation, but by expressing the bold spirit of a new Florida. By the time the final drawings were rolled out across the table, the dream of Whitehall had transformed into a measured blueprint. Every window had been considered, every column intentional, every hallway placed with purpose. The architects had captured the essence of Flagler's ambition, and he had shaped their work into an expression of his own journey. Now, the palace existed on paper, symmetrical, radiant, and ready to rise. All that remained was to bring it to life on the sandy edge of Palm Beach, where imagination would soon become stone. Bringing Whitehall from blueprint to reality meant confronting an environment that seemed almost determined to resist construction. Palm Beach was breathtaking, but it was also unforgiving. A place where sunlight burned through fabric, humidity warped lumber, and the ocean's salt carried the quiet ability to weaken anything not built with absolute intention. When the first crews arrived, they stepped onto land that offered no roads, no shade, and no established infrastructure. Everything the mansion required, stone, steel, marble, timber, glass, tools, would need to be transported across water, hauled over sand, and shaped under conditions few craftsmen had ever faced. Yet the moment the foundation markers appeared, an energy settled over the site. The workers sensed they were part of something monumental, something the world would remember. The logistics alone bordered on the unbelievable. Barges were loaded with crates of limestone, bundles of structural beams, and delicate shipments of imported plasterwork and decorative elements. These vessels navigated coastal shallows carefully, guided by pilots who studied the tides as though they were decoding a living puzzle. Once ashore, teams of laborers maneuvered the cargo using improvised tracks and rope systems, dragging materials across the island's unstable surface. Every load was a race against the heat, which intensified early in the day and lingered long after sunset. Men worked with wet cloth draped over their necks, dipping their hands and faces into cool water whenever the temperature climbed too high. Breaks were rare, and even in the shade of temporary shelters, the air felt heavy and thick, as though time slowed under the weight of the climate. To build Whitehall on this terrain, engineers had to introduce methods the state had never seen. Traditional foundations were impossible in shifting sand, so crews developed reinforced systems that locked pilings deep into the earth, creating a stable skeleton strong enough to support a mansion meant to rival European palaces. Wooden forms rose in geometric patterns as concrete was mixed on-site, an operation complicated by humidity that required mixtures to be adjusted by the hour. Every day presented a new challenge. Rainstorms swept in quickly, filling trenches and washing out freshly leveled ground. Ocean winds carried fine grains of sand that infiltrated equipment, and workers had to protect delicate materials from the corrosive salt that drifted inland with every breeze. The project demanded expertise and resourcefulness in equal measure, turning the site into an evolving laboratory of problem-solving. As the foundation settled and the first structural beams rose, the landscape began to transform. A place that had once been nothing more than open coastline slowly acquired shape and intention. Columns were hauled upright with ropes and hoists, guided into place with remarkable precision. Scaffolding climbed higher each week, forming a lattice that framed the skeletal outline of the mansion. Passers-by could already sense the scale of what was coming. The height of the beams, the width of the footprint, the perfect symmetry that hinted at a design far beyond anything Florida had ever seen. Even before a single wall was finished, the structure commanded attention, a silent declaration that the era of improvisation and temporary buildings was giving way to architecture of permanence. Inside the growing framework, craftsmen worked tirelessly. Stonecutters shaped blocks under tents stretched to shield them from the sun. Carpenters assembled intricate forms for arches and staircases. Metalworkers forged balustrades and brackets that would be gilded later, long after the structure was closed from the elements. Each trade moved with synchronized determination, aware that their work would be scrutinized in a house destined for national attention. Despite fatigue, despite the constant battle with weather, there was pride in every hammer strike and every carved detail. The workers understood they were part of a project that pushed the limits of engineering and endurance, a construction effort more ambitious than any Florida had attempted. Gradually, the white facade began to rise. At first a suggestion, then a presence, then a monument. Sunlight reflected from the fresh stone, making the emerging walls shine against the deep green of the surrounding palms. Visitors arriving by rail or by boat saw something otherworldly taking shape on the shoreline, a grand, pale structure that seemed to emerge not from sand, but from a dream aggressively insisted into reality. What had been an empty stretch of coast was now home to a growing giant, its columns standing tall against the horizon, its form visible from miles away. The mansion was still incomplete, but already it dominated the landscape, a promise of the elegance and grandeur that would soon fill its halls. Piece by piece, Whitehall was winning its battle with the sea, the sun, and the wildness of Florida, a testament to ambition that refused to bow to nature, and an early glimpse of the palace that would soon rise in full glory. As the structure gained height and definition, the true character of Whitehall began to reveal itself, not through its walls, but through the facade that Flagler believed would speak for the entire mansion. He was convinced that the first impression must feel almost ceremonial, a moment where every visitor, Whether a financier from New York or a traveler seeing Palm Beach for the first time would understand instantly that they were entering a world shaped by ambition, taste, and power. For that reason, the facade was not simply an exterior, it was the overture to the entire architectural symphony. Carrère and Hastings approached the design with the precision of sculptors rather than builders. They envisioned columns rising like sentinels, carrying the weight of the veranda atop them, and casting elegant shadows across the entry court as the sun shifted throughout the day. These columns, inspired by classical traditions, were not copied but reinterpreted to fit the subtropical light. Their fluting was deeper, their proportions subtly adjusted, so that in the bright Florida sun, they would appear crisp and commanding. Each one was carved with the expectation that it would withstand decades of salt wind and summer storms, without losing its refinement. The marmorizing of the exterior involved a level of craftsmanship rarely seen in the region. Imported stone was initially pale and unassuming, but once polished and set, it reflected sunlight with a quiet glow that made the mansion feel almost luminous. Against the deep blue of the coastal sky, Whitehall seemed to radiate from within. This glow was no accident. Flagler insisted that the house should look alive, as though it were breathing with the rhythm of the ocean. The architects responded by choosing materials that responded dynamically to changing light, soft at dawn, brilliant at noon, warm and amber-edged at sunset. Ornamentation followed, layered with intention. Above the entry, carved reliefs intertwined palm motifs with classical scrolls, merging Florida's identity with European elegance. Decorative urns crowned the balustrades, each one shaped with subtle variations, so the eye would move naturally from one to the next. These urns weren't simply embellishments, they were symbols of cultivation and permanence, visual reminders of Flagler's mission to transform wilderness into a place of refinement. Wrought iron gates framed the approach to the entrance, forged with swirling patterns that borrowed from both Beaux-Arts curves and the fluidity of ocean waves. Their dark metal contrasted sharply with the pale stone, adding a sense of threshold, a moment of transition between the world outside and the grandeur within. Craftsmen hammered each curve meticulously, creating gates that felt both protective and ceremonial. Passers-by often paused just to study the ironwork, drawn by its intricate precision, but the facade held more than artistry. It held meaning. Hidden among the scrolls and flourishes were symbols carefully chosen to reflect Flagler's journey. Laurel leaves, marking victory through perseverance. Shell motifs, nodding to the land and sea that defined Florida's identity. Subtle shield shapes, hinting at resilience in the face of adversity. Even the rhythm of windows was deliberate. Their arrangement created a sense of balance and clarity, a visual metaphor for order brought to a once untamed region. The entrance itself was designed to evoke a feeling bordering on awe. The veranda ceiling was coffered with astonishing detail, each recessed panel painted and gilded, so that even in the shade it shimmered softly. As visitors approached, they would see the interplay of gold and shadow above them, a quiet invitation to the splendor waiting inside. Large urns flanked the doorway like guardians, their carved reliefs echoing motifs from ancient temples. The architects understood that a first step into the mansion should feel transformative, a moment in which the outside world fell away and the visitor entered a realm shaped entirely by human vision and artistry. Flagler demanded perfection in every flourish. He argued about the angle of the pediment, the depth of the carvings, and the width of the steps leading into the hall. He tested the way footsteps echoed against the stone, how the facade appeared in early morning versus twilight, and whether the approach felt too abrupt or too leisurely. Nothing escaped his attention. He wanted a facade that would not simply impress. It needed to command silence, to make guests slow their pace, straighten their backs, and look upward with the quiet understanding that they were about to enter a masterpiece. By the time scaffolding came down, Whitehall's facade stood like a proclamation carved into the shore. Columns rose proudly, urns gleamed in the sunlight, gates welcomed with ornate curves, and the entire structure appeared both anchored and ethereal. It was the perfect introduction to the world within, a world that promised to elevate the imagination long before one crossed the threshold. Stepping through Whitehall's grand entrance was meant to feel like crossing an invisible threshold between the ordinary world and a vision crafted with almost theatrical precision. The moment guests passed beneath the gilded veranda and through the towering doors, they found themselves standing in the main hall, a space so commanding that it redefined their expectations before they had time to take a full breath. This hall was more than the starting point of the house. It was the emotional core of the entire estate, the place where Flagler wanted every visitor to grasp the magnitude of what he had created. To achieve that effect, Carrere and Hastings designed a room that blended engineering ingenuity with artistic ambition, a room built not only to impress but to overwhelm gently, the way a cathedral humbles through beauty rather than force. The hall rose 2 full stories, clad almost entirely in marble that seemed to glow from within. The stone was imported and chosen specifically for its clarity, depth, and subtle veining, qualities that allowed light to slide across its surface like water. Workers spent countless hours polishing each slab until it reflected not only the sunlight filtering through the upper windows, but the shimmer of gold leaf that traced the room's elaborate moldings. This luminous interplay of stone and gilding made the hall feel alive, shifting gently throughout the day as the sun arced across the sky. At dawn, the hall held a soft, pearly glow. At noon, it blazed with brilliance. By evening, the chandeliers cast warm halos that danced across the marble floors. But the true centerpiece, the element that defined the room, was the sweeping double staircase. Each curve of its balustrade was engineered with meticulous calculations, ensuring that the 2 flights ascended with perfect symmetry from opposite sides before merging at the landing above. Constructing such a staircase in Florida's climate was a remarkable feat. The underlying structure required reinforcement techniques seldom used in the region, allowing the staircase to appear effortlessly suspended despite its weight. The iron balustrades were crafted with coils and scrolls that echoed the patterns of the facade gates, unifying the visual language of the entire house. Above the landing, 4 clustered Ionic columns supported an intricately carved balcony, their presence evoking ancient temples, yet softened by the room's ethereal palette. The ceiling above them held an oval mural framed by layers of plasterwork so delicate that each vine, cherub, and ornamental flourish seemed to float. The mural was painted with a technique that allowed it to shift subtly, depending on where a viewer stood, a detail that contributed to the sense of movement throughout the hall. Flagler insisted that nothing in this room should feel static. He wanted the space to greet people, to embrace them in light, and to guide them naturally toward the rest of the mansion. Visitors often paused instinctively upon entering, compelled by the sheer scale and clarity of the space. Conversations softened, footsteps slowed, and even those accustomed to luxury felt a rare kind of reverence. Many remarked that it felt like walking into a European palace unexpectedly transported to the American coastline. That comparison was precisely what Flagler desired. He wanted Whitehall to announce that Palm Beach, once dismissed as wilderness, could host elegance equal to, or surpassing, the old world. From the main hall, a set of side doors revealed a different kind of wonder, the house's interior courtyard. While the hall embodied grandeur, the courtyard offered intimacy and calm, a contrast so intentional that the transition felt like stepping from a ceremonial stage into a quiet sanctuary. The idea of an open-air garden nestled at the heart of a mansion was rare in American residential design at the time, especially in a region where storms and unpredictable weather made indoor spaces preferable. Yet Flagler envisioned a courtyard that would defy expectations, a place where architecture and nature blended into something living, something that changed with the seasons and matured alongside the house. The courtyard was laid out with impeccable symmetry. Tile work formed geometric patterns across the ground, each piece chosen for its durability and its subtle variations in color that echoed Mediterranean and Moorish influences. At the center stood a fountain, its water rising and falling with a rhythm that softened the sounds of the world outside. The gentle splash echoed against the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt insulated from the heat and bustle of the coast. Surrounding the courtyard, slender columns supported shaded walkways that framed the view from every room connected to it. These arcades acted as both shelter and ornament, giving visitors vantage points from which to enjoy the sunlight without being consumed by it. Along the walls, trellises were installed with the hope that vines would eventually climb upward, weaving themselves through the structure and turning plaster and stone into something organic and ever-changing. This concept, walls that lived, breathed, and grew, was groundbreaking at the time. In Florida's climate, cultivating such a garden required careful planning, an understanding of light, water, and airflow, and the expertise of gardeners who blended artistry with science. The courtyard was not merely a visual pleasure, it served as a cooling heart for the entire mansion. Breezes passed through its open center and traveled into adjacent rooms, lowering temperatures naturally. At night, lanterns cast soft patterns on the walls and tiles, and the fountain's quiet murmur created a sense of peace that many guests described as unforgettable. Together, the main hall and the courtyard represented two halves of Whitehall's identity. One bold and radiant, the other serene and contemplative. The mansion was not designed as a static monument, but as a living environment, one that welcomed, impressed, calmed, and inspired all who stepped inside. Through these spaces, Flagler and his architects proved that Florida could host architecture as imaginative as it was ambitious. Architecture that did not imitate the world, but expanded it. Whitehall's grandeur did not rely solely on its halls and facades. The mansion's soul revealed itself in the rooms where thought, culture, and ritual intertwined. Among these, the library and the music room stood as twin sanctuaries, one devoted to contemplation, the other to expression, each designed to elevate the inner life of the house as much as its social one. The library occupied a space crafted with deliberate warmth, its walls rising 2 stories high and finished with half-height wood paneling that glowed softly under the natural light streaming through rounded windows. These windows were positioned with mathematical precision to catch the coastal sun at its most flattering angle, washing the room with a gentle radiance that shifted throughout the day. The architects wanted the library to feel grounded, yet uplifting, a place where thought could sharpen inside a setting of comfort and quiet dignity. The scent of polished wood mingled with the faint aroma of leather bindings, and the acoustics were engineered so that even a whisper felt contained, intimate, almost confidential. Above the bookshelves, the walls rose toward a ceiling, accented with subtle plasterwork, not overly ornate, but refined enough to remind visitors that this was no ordinary chamber. Every detail supported concentration, the placement of reading chairs, the orientation of desks toward the windows, the deliberate choice of deep colors that softened direct light. Scholars, writers, and influential guests often found themselves gathering here for discussions that stretched long into the afternoon. Conversations flowed about architecture, politics, literature, and the future of Florida, all unfolding beneath the steady gaze of oil portraits and the quiet rustle of pages being turned. Just steps away, the ambiance changed entirely as one entered the music room, a space designed not for silence, but for resonance. The architects treated it as an instrument itself, shaping the room's dimensions to carry sound with a clarity that felt almost theatrical. Chevron-patterned floors created visual energy beneath damask-covered walls, while the ceiling rose in a shimmering display of gold leaf accents that outlined plaster cherubs, garlands, and intricate cartouches. When light touched those gilded surfaces, the room seemed to glow, as if lit from within. Musicians treasured this room. A single piano note could linger with crystalline precision, filling the air without overpowering conversation. Strings warmed the space with gentle harmonies, and voices, whether singing or speaking, carried effortlessly. Gatherings here became legendary, small concerts for guests escaping northern winters, impromptu recitals after dinner, and evenings where music intertwined with laughter, creating memories that echoed across the mansion long after the last note faded. The room embodied refined leisure, a place where culture flourished just as vibrantly as the gardens outside. While the music room nourished the spirit, the dining room embodied the rituals of luxury, rituals executed with such precision that even guests unfamiliar with high society sensed the choreography unfolding around them. The dining room stood opposite the courtyard, enveloped in the darker tones that created atmosphere without heaviness. Rich wood paneling and a coffered ceiling added depth and gravitas, while a monumental fireplace served as the visual anchor of the room. Its carved detailing testified to the skill of the artisans who shaped it, their handiwork meant to impress even before the first course arrived. Behind the scenes, however, the true brilliance of this space emerged. Whitehall's service corridors formed a hidden network beneath and around the main rooms, engineered to allow staff to move silently between the kitchen and the dining area. Meals were prepared in an expansive kitchen, outfitted with the era's most advanced technology. Specialized stoves, temperature-controlled pantries, and meticulously arranged workstations that allowed chefs to operate with efficiency reminiscent of European royal households. Heat was managed through clever ventilation, and pantries were positioned strategically to keep ingredients cool in the subtropical climate. Once a meal was ready, dishes traveled through discreet doors and narrow passages, emerging in the dining room as though conjured from another world. Footmen moved with practiced synchronization, replacing plates, refreshing glasses, and adjusting settings so gently that conversation never paused. The engineering of service was almost invisible, and that invisibility was the point. Luxury, in Flagler's eyes, meant effort without spectacle, precision without noise. Guests experienced these dinners as a seamless performance. Candles reflected off polished silver. Crystal rang softly with each toast, and the glow of the fireplace cast warm patterns across the coffered ceiling. The dining room became a theater of refinement where social alliances were formed. Business deals whispered, and friendships deepened over multi-course meals drawn from both European and coastal traditions. Together, the library, music room, and dining spaces shaped the intellectual, emotional, and social heart of Whitehall. They offered depth, beauty, and purpose. A trio of rooms that reminded every visitor that luxury was not simply about appearance, but about creating environments where the mind, the senses, and the experience itself could flourish without restraint. The path from the library and dining room eventually led guests into two of Whitehall's most breathtaking spaces, the French salon and the ballroom, chambers designed not simply for decoration or comfort, but for spectacle. These rooms embodied the house's purpose as a social stage for the wealthiest circles of America, inviting guests to participate in evenings that blurred the line between event and performance. Here, artistry became architecture, and architecture became experience. The French salon was the first of these marvels, conceived as a tribute to the elegance of the Louis XV era. Flagler insisted on this style not only for its association with refinement, but because its playful curves, gilded ornamentation, and light pastel palette matched the personality of Florida itself, breezy, sunlit, and sensuous without excess. Entering the salon felt like stepping inside a jewelry box. Gilded panels rose from floor to ceiling, each one carved with meticulous detail, framing delicate murals that softened the room with hints of rose, ivory, and pale green. The coffered ceiling carried subtle paintings that glowed when the afternoon sun filtered through sheer curtains, creating a shimmer that seemed to move with the air. The furniture echoed the room's spirit, graceful, curved, upholstered in luxurious fabrics, arranged to encourage conversation rather than formality. This space was crafted to make guests linger, relax, and feel as though they had escaped the rigid structures of northern estates. Afternoon teas, small recitals, and intimate gatherings often unfolded here, each one surrounded by the gilded warmth of a room that felt both regal and welcoming. For many visitors, the French salon served as the introduction to a lifestyle that could exist only in a place where luxury and nature coexisted seamlessly. Beyond the salon, the atmosphere shifted dramatically as one approached the ballroom, Whitehall's monumental declaration of grandeur. Designed to rival the most celebrated halls of Newport and even the dance salons of Europe, it stunned guests the moment they crossed its threshold. The room expanded outward in glittering symmetry, the high walls clad in gilded panels that reflected the spark of crystal chandeliers suspended along the ceiling. These chandeliers cast shimmering light across polished parquet floors, which glowed like liquid gold beneath the hundreds of candles and electric fixtures blending together in perfect harmony. The acoustics of the ballroom were engineered for music that filled the space with clarity and emotion. Orchestras performed from the far end of the hall, their sound carried effortlessly through the soaring room so that every corner vibrated gently with melody. Guests danced in sweeping patterns, their movements mirrored in the glossy floor, while others gathered along the edges to talk and observe, their conversations rising and falling like harmony above the music. Banquet evenings here were unforgettable, tables dressed in immaculate linens, silver gleaming beneath candlelight, crystal glasses catching reflections from the chandeliers. Everything in this room existed to dazzle. It was in these spaces, the salon and the ballroom, that Whitehall became not just a mansion, but a social magnet. The house's daily rhythm was shaped by these rooms, which set the tone for an era defined by elegance and spirited celebration. During the height of the Gilded Age, Whitehall thrived as a beacon of coastal luxury, drawing an endless flow of elite visitors who arrived eager to experience Palm Beach through the lens of Flagler's creation. Evenings at Whitehall carried a particular enchantment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mansion seemed to awaken. Lanterns glowed along the verandas, chandeliers sparkled through tall windows, and music filtered into the gardens, where warm breezes carried the scent of blossoming vines. Guests dressed in their most refined attire, stepping through the illuminated entrance as if entering an entirely different world. The atmosphere shifted fluidly from anticipation to celebration as each evening unfolded. Dinner gatherings transitioned seamlessly into musical performances or conversations in the French salon. Those who craved movement drifted toward the ballroom, where lively dances continued well into the night. Others strolled through the courtyard, listening to the fountain's gentle rhythm, while the sounds of distant music wrapped the space in a soft, dreamlike echo. Servants moved elegantly through hidden corridors, maintaining the illusion that pleasure unfolded effortlessly. During the day, the house maintained a different charm. Light filled every room, revealing the interplay of pale marble, polished wood, and gold detailing. Guests gathered in the library for morning reading, or in the music room for casual rehearsals. The courtyard acted as the informal heart of the home, offering a peaceful refuge where conversations fell to whispers beneath the rustle of climbing vines. Through this steady rhythm of elegance, Whitehall gained a reputation as the Newport of the South, a title that reflected not only its grandeur, but its cultural importance. It became the seasonal nucleus of Palm Beach society, a place where alliances formed, ideas traded, and memories created in the glow of chandeliers and the shade of palm-lined verandas. Whitehall thrived because it offered more than luxury. It offered possibility. It showed visitors what Florida could become, transforming the coast into a stage upon which the Gilded Age played out its most glamorous scenes. And as each season passed, the house solidified its role as the crown jewel of a new American paradise, a place where the spirit of the era lived not in extravagance alone, but in the life that pulsed within its walls. Whitehall's brilliance endured for years, carrying the echoes of orchestras and celebrations long after each season ended. But the house that once embodied triumph eventually faced a turning point that neither architecture nor wealth could prevent. When Flagler suffered a devastating fall on the marble staircase he had once walked with such authority, the mansion's heartbeat changed. For months he fought to recover, surrounded by the very walls he had shaped with vision and pride. But his strength, once formidable, slowly faded. When he finally passed into rest, Whitehall, the palace he had built not just as a home, but as a symbol of Florida's rebirth, lost the presence that had given it purpose. Without him, the mansion became quieter. The gatherings stopped, music no longer floated through the ballroom, and the vibrant evenings that once defined the estate faded into memory. The house passed to his niece Louise, a woman whom some believed had a far deeper connection to Flagler than documents suggested. Yet despite her affection for the property, she faced the immense challenge of maintaining a structure designed for an era of grandeur and resources few could match. The costs of upkeep were staggering, the staff required to sustain the mansion's standards was immense, and the lifestyle that had made Whitehall flourish no longer matched the changing pace of the early 20th century. Eventually, Louise made the painful decision to sell the estate. What followed was a rotation of owners whose priorities shifted dramatically from preservation to profit. The new caretakers viewed Whitehall not as a masterpiece of the Gilded Age, but as real estate, an opportunity rather than a legacy. Corners were cut, repairs were delayed, cracks in the marble were patched instead of restored, leaks in the roof were tolerated until they spread. Salt-heavy air began to leave faint marks on the facade, and humidity seeped into the woodwork. Slowly, silently, the mansion's dignity began to erode. Years passed, and signs of deterioration multiplied. Fine plasterwork showed hairline fractures. Paintings faded under unchecked sunlight. The once lustrous parquet floors lost their sheen. But the greatest danger was apathy, the quiet belief that the house would always stand strong simply because it had stood strong before. Whitehall was too magnificent, too iconic, too big to fail. And so its decline continued, not with dramatic collapse, but with small, accumulating injuries that went unnoticed or unaddressed, like threads pulled from an otherwise flawless tapestry. Then came the decision that reshaped Whitehall's fate more drastically than any storm or shift in ownership: the transformation of the mansion into a hotel. To the developers who acquired the property, the estate was not a monument of artistry, but an underutilized asset. They envisioned a lucrative resort, something that would draw visitors with size rather than elegance. Whitehall's grandeur, in their eyes, was a foundation upon which to build something modern, something profitable. What followed was a reconstruction that many historians later called an architectural crime. A 10-story hotel tower rose beside the mansion, its bulk dwarfing the delicate proportions of Flagler's palace. The new structure devoured the servants' wing, eliminating entire sections of the original estate without hesitation. Rooms that had once been shaped with care and intention were carved into smaller units, their ceilings lowered, their details erased. The integrity of the floor plan, the flow of spaces that Carrere and Hastings had designed so thoughtfully, was disrupted beyond recognition. Inside, the damage was equally severe. Walls were knocked down or paneled over. Furnishings were removed to make space for hotel amenities. The hospitality focus demanded alterations that ignored the mansion's artistic and historical value. Plumbing lines cut through old foundation walls, electrical fixtures were installed without regard for symmetry, and the acoustics of the music room, once a triumph, suffered from careless modifications. Whitehall, once a place where beauty was crafted inch by inch, became something far more ordinary. The mansion was now forced to perform a role it had never been designed for, its soul overshadowed by the towering addition outside. Guests no longer arrived for balls or intellectual gatherings, but for transient stays, unaware that the walls surrounding them had once held a different kind of life entirely. The transformation marked the darkest chapter in the house's history, a period where commercial ambition eclipsed artistry, where convenience buried history, where elegance yielded to expedience. Whitehall remained standing, but its identity, its purpose, its harmony, its spirit had been fractured. The palace that once symbolized Florida's ascent had now become a wounded monument, waiting silently for someone to remember what it had once been. By the mid-20th century, Whitehall had become a shell of its former brilliance, still standing, still impressive from a distance, but suffocating under the weight of neglect and the monstrous hotel tower that clung to its side like a parasite. The great halls no longer echoed with music, the gold no longer sparkled, the marble felt cold and tired. It seemed that the house, once the pride of Florida's new era, was slipping quietly toward oblivion. And then came the moment that nearly sealed its fate: the announcement that the deteriorating mansion, now deemed impractical and unprofitable, was scheduled for demolition. For most, the news passed like a headline. Another victim of progress, another relic too expensive to preserve. But for Jean Matthews, Henry Flagler's granddaughter, it was an unthinkable betrayal. She had grown up with stories of the house, of Flagler's dream, of the parties, the music, the elegance that built the world around Palm Beach. She understood Whitehall not as a property, but as a chapter of American history, the architectural embodiment of a vision that had transformed a wilderness into a thriving state. The idea that bulldozers might erase that legacy in a matter of days ignited something fierce within her. Joan learned of the demolition plans almost by accident, through hushed conversations and vague reports circulating among local residents. When she finally confirmed the truth, she reacted not with despair, but with a clarity that surprised even herself. She would not let Whitehall vanish. She would not watch the palace that shaped Florida's identity become rubble beneath the Florida sun. And she would not allow developers, blinded by profit and convenience, to dismantle the home her grandfather had built with intention and genius. What followed was a battle few believed she could win. Jean launched a movement that grew with astonishing speed, forming a non-profit organization later known as the Henry Flagler Museum. Her goal was monumental: raise enough money to buy back the estate from the developers, negotiate the release of the property from the commercial use, and then fund its restoration. At first, the idea seemed impossible. The developers were confident, the tower was generating revenue, and many doubted that anyone would care enough about an old Gilded Age mansion to fight for it. But Jean understood something they didn't. Whitehall was loved, not loudly, not publicly, but deeply. Historians, architects, Palm Beach residents, preservation advocates, and those who had long admired Flagler's legacy began stepping forward. Donations arrived quietly at first, then steadily, then in significant sums as the story spread. Jean lobbied tirelessly, speaking at gatherings, attending council meetings, writing letters, and arguing passionately for the cultural and architectural importance of the estate. Her resolve never wavered, even as developers resisted, offering delays, alternative proposals, and inflated pricing. The battle drew national attention. What had begun as a simple preservation effort evolved into a symbol of resistance. One determined woman standing against an entire industry that saw heritage as expendable. The negotiations stretched for years, marked by setbacks, breakthroughs, and tense stalemates. But Jean refused to surrender. Her conviction became the anchor of the entire movement. When the purchase was finally secured in 1959, it felt less like a transaction and more like a rescue. Whitehall had been pulled back from the edge. Securing the estate was only the beginning. Once the nonprofit gained possession, the true scale of the damage became painfully clear. The towering hotel addition cast a long shadow over the fragile remains of the mansion. Its demolition would require immense planning, funding, and the coordination of specialized crews. The structure was torn down floor by floor, piece by piece, revealing sections of Whitehall's exterior that had not seen sunlight in decades. When the last chunk of concrete fell, the mansion stood alone again, wounded but breathing, a patient finally freed from its oppressor. Restoration became an act of devotion. Craftspeople studied old photographs, blueprints, paintings, and written descriptions to understand not only what Whitehall looked like, but what it felt like. Marble floors were polished until they regained their mirror-like clarity. Gold leaf was reapplied with painstaking care to ceilings, cornices, and decorative friezes. Damask wallpaper was recreated by artisans who employed techniques nearly lost to time. Furniture was tracked down, restored, or replicated, returning each room to its original character. Even the acoustics of the music room were revived, allowing sound to dance through the space just as it had more than half a century earlier. Piece by piece, the magic returned. The courtyard once again became an oasis, vines creeping up the trellises just as the architects once dreamed. The main hall regained its luminous glow, the double staircase curving upward with renewed elegance. The ballroom reclaimed its sparkle, with chandeliers casting prismatic reflections across the perfectly restored parquet floor. Visitors began walking through the mansion, not as hotel guests, but as witnesses to history, as individuals stepping into the world Flagler had imagined for Florida. Today, Whitehall stands as a museum, a living testament to ambition, artistry, and resilience. It is not merely preserved, it is reborn. Tour guides speak softly about the parties, the innovations, the tragedies, and the victories that shaped the estate. Scholars travel from around the world to study its architecture, while visitors marvel at its scale and splendor. The house feels whole again, not as a replica of its past, but as a bridge connecting generations. Above all, Whitehall stands as proof that some wonders survive not because they are indestructible, but because someone refuses to let them disappear. It is a miracle of preservation, a palace that could have been lost forever, saved by determination, restored with love, and celebrated today as one of the greatest treasures of America's Gilded Age.